regret to say that I am Professor Snyder for today. And we'll talk about nationalism and ethnic conflict, and give you some sort of framing and discussion points for the readings for this week, which were selected by Professor Snyder, and you will have an opportunity to discuss them in considerably more detail in your sections. So what are we doing today? What are we doing with today's session? In a sense, we're returning to some of the questions with which we started this semester. Questions of political identity and political behavior that really surfaced when we talked first about states and citizens nearly a month ago. Having examined how states interact with each other and looked at different perspectives on American power in the world, now we focus once again on the relationship between the local and the global, and particularly look at what is ordinarily pretty local politics. The forces of globalization obviously impinge. For those of you who have already done the reading, you can see the relationship between individual and community identity and the forces that are global in scale that contribute to shaping those identities. But it's also true that we are looking at individuals and communities when we talk about ethnic groups, nationalisms, nations, and so forth. Like much of what we have done in conceptual foundations to this point, and much of what the rest of the semester will be devoted to, questions of ethnicity and nationalism are bedeviled by definitional debates. And this is not only important because some of us like the abstract debates about definitions, but because depending on how you define some of the terms that we'll be throwing around this week, depending on how you define a nation, how you define nationalism, how you think about what animates nationalist activities, a set of policy recommendations are likely to flow from that. So I'm going to be talking about some of the issues that are involved in the definitions that people use for ethnic group, for nation, for nationalism, and so forth. And again, at this point, it may seem on the abstract side. But in fact, as you will see, I think today, and certainly by the time you get to your discussion, there is a very important relationship, in this instance, as in many others, between how you define the terms you're using and the conclusions you draw about what ought to be done in the relevant policy arenas. There is a vast literature on nationalism, very little of which will you be exposed to directly over the course of this week. But let me recommend that there are some very good websites that can provide you with bibliographies. There's one called the Nationalism Project, nationalismproject.org, which has a very good bibliography if you want to really root around in this literature in depth. There are, in this very large literature, lots and lots of people have examined the issues around nationalism. There are 3 or 4 principal debates. First are the definitional debates. How do we define nation? How do we define nationalism? What's the relationship between belonging to a nation and being a nationalist? Secondly, where do nations come from? How do we attribute history to what we have concluded are nations once we finish defining it? And how do nations and nationalisms develop? Are they things that have been the same since the beginning of time, or do they change over time? Not only are there different particular nationalisms, but is there something characteristic about nationalism today that was absent 300 years ago? Was there nationalism 300 years ago? And finally, although not finally, because as you can imagine, these are debates that go on forever, how do we manage relations between and among nations, or between and among ethnic groups? So those are some of the kinds of issues that characterize this literature and about which we're going to be talking this week. All right, so what is nationalism and where did it come from? in some respects, there are two features to the way we talk about and the way we think about nations and nationalism. On the one hand is an aspect of the notion that is attached to individuals. It's an attitude or an identity. So it's an attitude of affiliation, an attitude of identifying with other people that identify with the same community. So individuals are implicated in discussions of nationalism. There have to be members of the nation, and there have to be people who recognize themselves as members of a nation. Some of the members you can attribute membership to if you want to, and you can say, well, I know that all of this group X, or whatever group you want to describe them as, and there may be half a dozen people, if you will, in that group that don't say, I am an X. But by and large, nationalism assumes that the individuals involved will be able to say, I am an X. I recognize my individual relationship with this larger community. So that's one side of this coin, and that's an important side, because you couldn't have a nation full of people who didn't recognize, who didn't acknowledge that this was part of their identity. And secondly, it is also, in important ways, an activity, or nationalism is an activity designed to achieve and sustain something. So not only are you an X, are you a member of this community, but you aspire to certain things for that community. Typically what you aspire to is some version of self-determination for the community. Not for you as an individual within it, but for the community as a whole. Right? So not only am I an X, but I think all X's should have certain kinds of rights, should have rights for communal autonomy, should be able to make decisions for the community of X's. So I am, both as an individual, this is my identity, but I also attach a certain ideology to that identity. So nationalism, in a sense, has two faces. It has a face as an identity and attributing certain features and characteristics to that identity, and it has a face that's really an ideology, that there's certain political consequences of having that identity. There are different ways to describe this, but in a sense it asserts, nationalism asserts the supremacy of the nation's claims, the being an X, over other claims to individual allegiance. In other words, of the many, many things I could be, as we've discussed this before, I could be a member of my nuclear family, I could be a member of my neighborhood, I could be a member of my university, my place of employment, all sorts of things. But the most important thing to me is that I'm an X. Fill in that blank. Whatever nation you want to use as your example. And, as I say, so it makes claims for my individual allegiance, and it argues for self-determination for all of the people who make that claim, who have that allegiance. Now, what alternatives are there? In this modern world, it's hard to imagine the world without nationalism. It's hard to imagine a world where people don't identify themselves as members of a community that is, in some respects, associated with the idea of a nation. Well, obviously, some of the other things that I just described could be alternatives. I could prefer to identify myself with my family. I could prefer to identify myself with my region of origin, which is not a nation and doesn't aspire to national status. I could identify myself as associated with my professional association or other kinds of identities. But typically, one of the things that characterizes the last 150 years is how powerful nationalism has been in providing identities and providing vehicles for political action. And in some respects, the only thing that has been as powerful a collective identity for political action over the last 150 years or so is class. Remember, workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. So for the last 150 years or so, class identity has been very powerful in driving political action, and people could describe themselves as members of classes. But it tells you something about how quickly history fades when it begins to fade, that seems virtually completely implausible at this point. And most identities for politics are really about ethnic identity and national identity. So I could be a member of a political party, and that could be more important than anything else to me, or I could be a member of my family, and that could be more important than anything else to me. But typically in this day and age, many of these identities end up congealing around an ethnic or national identity. The intellectual debates around nationalism, however, over the last 150 years are very often best understood, and I commend this perspective to you in contrast to debates about class identity. In other words, there were, say, in Eastern Europe in the latter half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, very powerful, important, and interesting arguments about what the most effective and most important identity ought to be as people came from Eastern Europe into debates with Western Europe and thought about development and thought about the purposes of development and thought about the empowerment of communities and so forth. This was the context in which these kinds of large-scale identities, whether they were class or whether they were national, were seized and animated during that century or so. Now, nationalism proved to be particularly powerful, say many of the social scientists who study nationalism and nations. Nationalism proved to be particularly powerful because of its association with states. One of the things about many of the political movements associated with class analysis, with international socialism and so forth, was that they were deliberately opposed to the divisions represented by states. Nationalism, of course, is not opposed to the divisions represented by states. It may be a particular nationalist movement may be opposed to a particular state, but it's not in principle opposed to the system of states. And in fact is almost predicated on the system of states, because if you assume that nations aspire to at least autonomy and at most sovereignty, then they're really talking about a relationship with the state system. And what they want is not to destroy the state system so much as to become a member of the state system, to have the nation expressed in a sovereign state. As Ernest Gellner, whom you read, and who is one of the major figures in many of the debates around nations and nationalism, put it, and I quote, "Nationalism emerges only in the milieu in which the existence of the state is already very much taken for granted." Okay. Now this is an interesting point to which I will return momentarily, but note that he is already saying that there is nothing timeless or ancient about nations and nationalism. He's saying that basically, starting with the Peace of Westphalia and the development of the state system, you begin to see nationalism. Now, most nationalist advocates, most nationalist political figures will argue that the particular nationalism that they're advocating is ancient. Okay? Comes from the distant mists of time, this community. But Gellner's already tipping us to what's going to turn out to be a very complicated question about the nature of the nationalisms that we confront today. But let's pause for a moment and think to ourselves, why should it be related to the state? What is it about the state that would elicit these kinds of identities? If we assume, as Gellner does, and I will make this case in more detail in a minute, that in fact nationalisms appear simultaneously and very often after the appearance of the modern state. Well, remember when we talked about the relationship between states and citizens, and the extent to which the identity of a citizen associated with the state is very thin gruel, that a citizen is interchangeable, equal before the law, faceless, all the same, stripped of any uniqueness or defining characteristics. We're all the same as citizens in these new modern states. Well, obviously, or perhaps not obviously, but one can certainly argue, that for many people, particularly people who did not enjoy the full rights of citizenship, this is not enough. It is not enough simply to be an abstract member of an abstract community. You want, we want, one wants an identity that has some substance to it, that actually celebrates the variety of people in the world and the uniqueness of each of us, and says, yes, speaking that language, having that history, enjoying those traditions, those things are special and important, and they shouldn't be washed out of our political identity. On the contrary, they themselves give us a community that is deeply important to us as an identity and should be represented in this world of states. So the states themselves begin to both elicit and reflect, if you will, a substantive content, a character of community that they are supposed to be the sovereign expression of. So there's an intimate relationship between what develops as a political identity and political ideology and the appearance of this state system that we talked about some time ago. So the unique characteristics of us, the things that make us interesting, are not that we are, a voter, because we're all voters, and that doesn't tell us anything, but the kinds of things that ethnic and national identity prize, that we speak certain languages, that we come from certain regions, that we have certain kinds of histories, that we enjoy certain cultural traditions and patterns of behavior and things that we enjoy with other people who enjoy them too. And that's the beginning of that kind of community. These languages and cultures are important to us. They are part of our identity, and we identify with other people who have those languages and cultures. Particularly for people who felt themselves, if you will, behind the most modern countries, that is to say, in the 19th century in Eastern Europe, and then later those in the rest of the world who felt themselves oppressed by imperial control, nationalism was a way to assert value, was a way to say, this nation of which I am, the people who speak this language, the people who come from this area, the people who have these traditions, is as important and meriting as significant standing in the world as the first states, as France or Britain, or these kinds of sovereign entities to which we aspire now. We being, as I say, in Eastern Europe in the 19th century and in much of the post-colonial world in the 20th century. So we see the beginning of nationalism, we see the beginning of political movements built around these kinds of communities, and we can see the beginning to some extent of why there would be, if you will, a space for that kind of community in this growing state system. But that still doesn't tell us entirely about what a nation is and what kinds of things contributed to the development of the nations once you have this state system that begins, as I say, to sort of, if not elicit it, leave a space for concentrating on these kinds of identities. Among the most popular definitions of a nation is that of Benedict Anderson. And so I'm going to quote him at length to give you a sense of the factors or the features of a nation that he has drawn out. This is on the website that I gave you before, as well, of course, in his book, Imagined Communities, Reflections on the Origin and Spread of Nationalism. He says, a nation is an imagined political community, and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. So yes, nations are communities that aspire to sovereignty. There are many communities that don't. And whatever else they may be, from his perspective, they are not nations. Now, he goes on to say, it is imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, never meet them or even hear of them. Yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. This is an identity that's important to me, and I know that there are other people out there for whom it is also important, even if I never encounter them. Communities are to be distinguished not by their falsity or genuineness. In other words, if I know that, it doesn't really matter whether other people could say, oh, but that didn't exist 50 years ago, but by the style in which they are imagined. So he discusses non-national communities. He says, Javanese villagers, for example, have always known that they're connected to people they have never seen. But these ties were once imagined particularistically as indefinitely stretchable nets of kinship and clientship. Until quite recently, the Javanese language had no word meaning the abstraction society. So one of the characteristics of a nation is that it is abstract. It is not simply all the people I might be related to. It transcends that. It's something that goes beyond simply the personal connections I may have and they may have. It's more than iterated 6 degrees of separation. It is actually an abstract idea that I have imagined myself as a member of this community. As he puts it, to go on, and this is another way of thinking about the same issue, we may think of the French aristocracy of the Ancien regime as a class today. We impose the idea of classness on that aristocracy, looking retrospectively. But surely it was imagined this way, he says, only very late. If you ask who is the Comte de X, the normal answer would not have been a member of the aristocracy, but the Lord of X, the uncle of Baron de Y, or a client of Duc de Z. In other words, until you had these abstractions, the idea of the state and the idea of the nation, people imagined themselves only in terms of the extension of their personal connections. Now we have an abstract, as he said, imagined community. Now the nation is imagined as limited, because even the largest of them, says he, encompassing perhaps 1 billion living human beings, has finite if elastic boundaries, beyond which lie other nations. So just as the existence of a state is predicated on the existence of a state system, the existence of a nation is predicated on the existence of other nations. I can distinguish myself as a member of X because I'm not a member of Y. But there are people who are members of Y. There are other communities that I am in contrast to. So there have to be multiple nations for the idea of this imagined community of nationhood to make sense. No nation imagines itself coterminous with mankind. Now one could argue, and perhaps you want to play with this in section as you discuss this, that perhaps cosmopolitanness, as we are beginning to understand it, the cosmopolitan identity, is actually coterminous with mankind and is actually a 21st century version of this kind of identity. But certainly when we talk about nations and nationalism, no nation imagines itself coterminous with all of humanity. And finally, it is imagined as sovereign because, and again I'm quoting Benedict Anderson, the concept was born in an age in which the Enlightenment and Revolution were destroying the legitimacy of the divinely ordained hierarchical dynastic realm. Nations dream of being free. The gauge and emblem of this freedom is the sovereign state. So a nation does aspire to sovereignty. Now, some never achieve it, but that aspiration is characteristic of a nation. And finally, he says, it is imagined as a community, because regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each, the nation is always conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship. Ultimately, it is this fraternity that makes it possible over the past 2 centuries for so many millions of people not so much to kill as willing to die for such limited imaginings. So those are the elements of what goes into the way we understand what a nation is. Are there different kinds of nations within that comprehensive definition? Well, for Gellner, there are Western and Eastern kinds of nationalism. And other people talk about civic and ethnic nationalisms. Ethnic nationalisms, more characteristic of what I was describing before, with an emphasis on culture, language, tradition, common characteristics of the members of the community, language, origin, tradition, culture, sometimes at its extreme race. Membership in these ethnic nations is understood as involuntary. That is to say, if you were born with those characteristics, you are a member of the nation. And the state reflects the essential character of the nation when there is such a state. And classic examples include Germany and Turkey, both of which are ethnic nations reflected in states. Or a civic nationalism, any group of people aspiring to or loyal to a common state. Membership is here in some sense voluntary, and the classic case of civic nationalism is the United States. And you should reflect on what it is, that if there is any content to American nationalism, what it is. And Professor Sestanovich talked a little bit about what might characterize an American nationalism. But in that notion of a civic nationalism, the state reflects consensus around common political values, legal norms, and moral commitments far more than it does around a common language or cultural tradition. Now, rarely is the distinction quite as clear-cut as I just suggested. Most civic nationalisms have some ethnic component to it, and most ethnic nationalisms have some civic characteristics. But the distinction exists in the literature, and it may be useful as you think about what kinds of policies to manage ethnic and national conflict you would advocate. For example, there is a dispute right now, or a debate right now, about Israel as a Jewish state, that's an ethnic nationalism, or Israel as a democratic state, granting all of its residents equal political rights, that would be a civic nationalism. So even today, even in particular instances, the definition of how the content of the nationalism is understood will shape policy in quite dramatic terms in that instance. Now, most discussions of nationalism are about the first kind, about the aspirations of an ethnic group that does not have or has only recently attained sovereignty. This is in part because most states have nations of some sort. But many nations, the Iroquois, the Kurds, the Berbers, the Yoruba, do not have states. And so one of the characteristics of much of this discussion is not about the civic nationalism associated with sovereign states, but about ethnic nationalisms, particularly subnational or non-national, non-state nationalism that aspire to sovereignty. Okay, so where did these things come from? Another debate in the literature. Where do these identities come from, and where do we understand them? Now, obviously, as you can tell from my reliance on Gellner and Benedict Anderson, much of the social science literature sees these identities as quite modern and very much a reflection of relatively new institutional forms like states. But typically nationalists themselves favor and foster myths of common origin in the distant past. National identity for many of the nationalists in the world today is timeless and what we call primordial. That is to say, never shaped by anything. So whatever your national affiliation is, X, has always existed, and people have always belonged to X from the very beginning of time. And X may have been beleaguered by opposition by Ys and Zs, but there has always been an X. And in fact, it probably has a very valiant history of fighting off the depredation of Ys and Zs. Nationalisms almost always do. So they have long and distinguished heroic histories, and they are invariant in their existence. They have always been there. In that sense, states should reflect pre-existing nations. Nations were always here, say the nationalists. They are primordial, and the relationship between these nations, the X's and the Y's and the Z's, often reflect what are routinely described as ancient hatreds. So when you see language like that about the fact that the X's and Y's have never gotten along, and that one of the things that we're going to have to deal with if we think about managing conflict is managing the fact that these people have never gotten along, the people who are making that kind of argument are implicitly endorsing a primordialist interpretation of the nature of nations and nationalism. Obviously, this is not Anderson or Gellner's position. And indeed, they argue, and this is again something you may want to consider, that a committed nationalist, somebody who is an advocate for his or her national identity, sovereignty, and so forth and so on, cannot be a social scientist. And a social scientist cannot be a committed nationalist. Because the committed nationalist needs to privilege that nation and that nation's history over other nations and over historical interpretation that might suggest that this nation did not always exist and was not always beleaguered and was not always deserving of sovereignty, whether it had it or not. There is a variant between the completely constructed version of nationalism, which I'll get to in a minute, and primordial, which is a sort of perennialist position, arguing that nations have been around for a very long time, although they take different shapes at different points in history. This can be more easily reconciled than the primordialist position with social science, although, as you saw, Benedict Anderson thinks that those kinds of early senses of common membership in a community were not the abstract nationalisms of the modern world. And in fact, he and many people who study nationalism believe that nations are built, often through the very hard work of nationalists. And your or my affiliation with Nation X is partly a reflection of the fact that I have been advertised to, I have been recruited to, I have been persuaded that this is the most important identity I could have. And that it takes nationalists a lot of very hard work to see flowering that kind of affiliation with the nation. Reviving languages, inventing histories, nations are constructed. So the constructivists in international relations theory find this interpretation of nationalism obviously completely congenial. Now, clearly, you construct with things that are available, materials that are available to you. You don't construct a national identity around a completely invented language. Esperanto did not produce nationalism. But you can take languages that are liturgical languages, languages that are minority languages, languages that seem to be disappearing, and construct political identities around them, and that has happened repeatedly. Look at the history of Eastern Europe. Look at the history of the Middle East. Language has been very important in the flowering of national identity in those regions. Sometimes nations reflect states and are constructed around the existence of states. This is obviously true in the case of civic nationalism, but it can also be true in what becomes, over the course of time, an ethnic identity. And one of the most wonderful works illustrating the creation of an ethnic identity is a book called Peasants into Frenchmen by Eugene Weber. And it's a wonderful description of how people in France over the course of time come to think of themselves as French, as opposed to their local identities, their regional identities, their dialectical identities. Eric Hobsbawm's position, also a wonderful student of nationalism, among many other things, is typical. He says, like most serious students, and we're all serious students here, I do not regard the nation as a primary or as an unchanging social entity. It belongs exclusively to a particular and historically recent period. It's a social entity only insofar as it relates to a certain kind of modern territorial state. And it is pointless to discuss nation and nationality except insofar as both relate to it. All right, so the social scientists among us are interested in nations because we're interested in trying to figure out how they come to be constructed and how, once constructed, they come to take on a very powerful life in politics within states, between states, among other national groups. And it's a politically important distinction. Nationalists are, above all, political actors and argue the reality of the ancientness of their ethnic groups or claims has certain moral standing. So when you think about the ways that people analyze nationalism and then the ways that they advocate nationalism, those are two very different projects. And for this week, we are analysts, and then those of you who want to be advocates should feel free to do so. But for this week, we're analysts. And one of the things that's interesting about the intersection of analysts and advocates is that you can, as an analyst, see, you can disaggregate the vehicles with which nations are put together. So as I suggested, you have the revival of languages, and this is important in part because of the abstract character of nations. Everybody who speaks a similar language is going to be part of the nation, whether we know each other or not. And in fact, Anderson argues that it is in part because of what he calls print capitalism, the increasing availability of newspapers in vernacular languages that permitted people to imagine themselves as part of a community of other people who read those newspapers in those vernacular languages. But there are other ways in which people construct these sorts of identities, and one of them is, of course, archaeology, and looking at the ancientness of the claims. So one of my favorite examples of this is looking at the archaeology of the Italians in Libya, as they, during the interwar period, when Italian nationalism was at its height, when they were trying to claim that their imperial project in Libya was the revival of the Roman Empire. So doing archaeology and finding Roman sites in Libya where they were the imperial powers was one of the ways that they justified their claims to the territory. Because what Italy was, and so they called Libya the fourth shore, what Italy was the modern incarnation of the Roman Empire. And their control of the North African territories that they had in Libya was justified because the Romans had been there, and you could see that because of the archaeological sites. So that's part of the way that nations are constructed and glued together, and the way that the moral claims that nations make are justified. Languages, history, all sorts of things are brought to bear on, particularly when there are competing claims. There will be competing claims over interpretations of history, over the primacy of particular languages, so forth and so on. You can, no doubt, think of examples yourself. Okay, now, even if you argue that nations, or perhaps particularly if you argue that nations are constructions, at least in their political guise, you will want to know how that nationalism is catalyzed. What makes us active? Why are we not just sitting around being happy X's? Well, part of it is that there is an intrinsic competition, if you will, because, as I said, as with states, there isn't a single state, there is a state system. And similarly with nations, there isn't a single nation, there is a system of nations. But what catalyzes the awareness of that, and then the awareness of other nations, is, or at least Anderson argues, is things like print capitalism, is things like being able to read and realizing that only some people are reading what you're reading and other people are reading other things and reading it in other languages. So language becomes one of the important features of modern nationalism, in part because of the importance of the technology of the printing press, technologies of communications, in other words, were part of the features around which people develop these common identities. And in that sense, Lynch's discussion of Al-Qaeda is particularly interesting, because in a sense, what he argues in that piece about Al-Qaeda as a constructivist project is that it is a function of new communications technologies that is not only permitting people to interact with each other in novel ways, but is potentially creating opportunities for new kinds of identities. Identities that are not linked only to the technology of the printing press or the character of vernacular languages. So he argues that Al-Qaeda's principal goal is the construction of a new transnational and trans-state identity based in Islam, to define the interests that follow from this identity, and to create transcendent norms that would establish a logic of appropriateness governing Muslim life. So in other words, he's analogizing to the construction of nations through emphasis on the printing press and on common vernacular languages that Benedict Anderson did. He's analogizing and saying there's something about these new technologies that are going to privilege different kinds of identities, and that these identities may or may not operate exactly the way classic nationalisms and nations have operated. So you can think about whether you think that, in a sense, Al-Qaeda is very little to do with identity and ideology, a great deal to do with identity and ideology, but in the same way as classical nations and nationalism, or a modern variant of that that's really a reflection of new kinds of technologies for communication. Certainly that's in part what Lynch is arguing, that there is a public and private outreach. There are entrepreneurs who are trying to create this identity and trying to get people to adhere to it, from the global media to innovative uses of the internet to, in addition, intensely personal recruitment. Now, Lynch is obviously a constructivist, but I want you also to note the extent to which he points out the temptation of a primordialist interpretation of what Al-Qaeda is doing. As he says, there is nothing obvious or natural about the Islamist identity proclaimed by Al-Qaeda. To take this as the evocation of a deep essentialist identity is to grant bin Laden victory in the single most important stage of constructing reality. The rhetoric about a global Islamic identity aims at driving a self-fulfilling prophecy, constructing a collective identity rather than simply reflecting it. And in that sense, this is very much like the nationalist entrepreneurs. They want to create something that people will then, as a self-fulfilling prophecy, find their own identity and find a political movement in. But as anyone who reads the newspaper will know, there is a very strong temptation to see the Islamist movements as born in and reflecting primordial Islam, rather than see it as being constructed out of available materials, but also using brand new technologies. And that would be the way people understood the development of many of the nationalisms in the world today. Okay, why do people subscribe to nationalist ideologies? Even if people are exposed to ideas that permit them to imagine themselves in communities that transcend their personal experience, why act on those ideas? Well, again, there are a number of different approaches to this sort of question. One of them I've been suggesting that there are sets of elite entrepreneurs who create the circumstances in which people adhere to these sorts of identities and ideologies, and they're competing with other kinds of entrepreneurs. For example, as I suggested earlier, there was a very powerful competition to nationalism in socialism and communism as a organizing vehicle for identity and for political action. And there were entrepreneurs who were competing for the loyalties of all sorts of people throughout Europe and the rest of the world during the late 19th and early 20th century for precisely those kinds of identities and those kinds of political movements. So one way of thinking about this is that you're looking at the incentives of individuals, and a nationalist would say that there doesn't need to be any incentive, that actually we are all proto-nationalists ourselves anyway, and we just act on behalf of our nation out of love for our fellow members of the nation. So it's natural to be a nationalist. Okay. Or it's irrational to be a nationalist, that you're being manipulated by the elites, that this is a form of false consciousness. Or it's rational to be a nationalist, and there are a set of theories associated with rational choice that suggests that nationalism is a way of engendering trust among community members that makes their cooperation easier, and it's therefore a lubricant in relations among rational individuals. So it could be, and the analysis you will see all three of those kinds of approaches, that there's nothing to explain, that of course there's something to explain, but the people are being manipulated and they are falsely conscious, or there's something to explain, but this is really rational action, and therefore one could expect that rational actors would affiliate with these kinds of communities and identities because it makes it easier, certainly for in-group interactions. And to have strong in-group interactions, typically you have hostile out-group interactions. And that's one of the ways to think about the relationship between nationalities and ethnic groups when they're in conflict. This rationalist approach does raise another interesting question, which we do not have time to talk about today, but you may have time to talk about in the section, which is, when does it make sense to switch identities? If you're thinking about this as a matter of rational choice, then in a sense, any calculating individual would decide that it may be smarter to be an X than a Y, or a Y than an X in any given moment. This obviously suggests that national identity is not something you're involuntarily forced into or stuck with because of where you're born or what you were born as, but that you have options. You can change if there are appropriate incentives for a rational individual. And there are a number of interesting studies that examine when people seem to switch from one kind of identity to another in circumstances in, for example, Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. A political scientist named David Layton has done a lot of this sort of work. But on more local ground, in any event, when do the Irish living in the United States decide that they are Americans of Irish heritage. That's a choice, and it's a set of choices that presumably can be understood in terms of the rational calculus of the individuals in question. All right, those are the sorts of things that the students of nations and nationalisms debate all the time. Let's assume for the moment that we've hacked our way through the underbrush of definitional debates, and we have all concluded that we know a nation when we see one, and we know nationalism when we see it in action, and there is some sort of consensus on those questions, which obviously there is not in the literature, including the literature that you've been reading for this week. How does nationalism intersect with other kinds of political processes? It doesn't appear and develop in a vacuum. There are pre-existing states, there are other nations, there are kinds of political institutions, there are political processes of various kinds. So where is nationalism in all of this? This has a couple of normative features and some empirical features. The normative in some respects are the more interesting, but not something we will be detained by long. But it's worth keeping in mind that nationalism is sort of, if you will, morally ambivalent. We feel solidarity with oppressed peoples and sympathy with their nationalist aspirations on the one hand, but are also, in different circumstances, repulsed by what seem to be the crimes perpetrated in the name of nationalism, notably ethnic cleansing. So it's not something where typically most of us will say we think nationalism is in and of itself a good thing or a bad thing. Sometimes it seems like a good thing, and sometimes it seems like a bad thing. And it would be interesting for each of us to explore in our hearts when we think one or the other. Similarly, nationalism creates dilemmas for international justice. Do we privilege the existing sovereign states, even in the face of nationalist movements that are contesting the legitimacy of those states? Or take a more, and the states themselves, of course, make a nationalist claim to their primacy and their sovereignty? Or do we take what might be a more cosmopolitan view, limiting sovereignty on behalf of what are usually unsovereign, unrecognized, aspiring nations? So that's the responsibility to protect, to which we will be returning later in the semester. But much of these kinds of questions about the responsibility to protect or the pros and cons of supporting nationalist movements and so forth are really a reflection of the fact that this is a very vexed area, not only in terms of definitions and policies, but also in terms of the normative status of the nations in question. If we assume that all nations deserve states, then we're fairly tolerant of the use of force as a legitimate means for winning sovereignty. But if we don't assume that, then we are fairly tolerant of quite repressive actions against aspirant nations. And if we're nationalists on our own behalf, what of other nationalisms? If your nation, is your nationalism particularistic? In other words, all you really care about is your own nation, you're only an X? Or do you think that everybody should have a nation and nationalism? So you're a sort of universalistic, if you will, nationalist. So it's not only fine for you to be a nationalist, but everybody should. In which case, you obviously, in one case, you have no sympathy for any of the people on the other, outside of your own community. In the second case, you may acknowledge them, but the chances are that you're going to be competing over some of the limited resources in the world. So there's a whole set of normative questions which I commend to you. And there's some policy questions. If we think in terms of the competing definitions and the competing relationships among these kinds of communities, we need to be thinking about what causes or what kinds of things contribute to ethnic conflict. Because one could imagine, although it's a stretch, world of nations that all are content, that all have as much sovereignty as they want, that all have as much of the other goods that they, and values in the world that they want, that everybody who imagines him or herself as a member of one of these communities is actually in it and has no obligations to any other communities. One could imagine that, but of course in practice, there are communities that aspire to values, to make claims that are at the expense of other communities. So there is ethnic conflict. There is competing nationalisms and competing over territory, competing over moral claims, competing over United Nations recognition, competing over all sorts of things. One of the ways to think about this is to think about it in terms of nations as analogous to states in international relations theory. And that's what Barry Posen does in his discussion of the security dilemmas that contribute to ethnic conflict. That groups tend to see themselves as threatened, they tend to try and protect themselves. In doing so, they tend to seem threatening to other groups, and then you see the escalation of that kind of security dilemma and competition. And it's hard from that perspective to see how you can diminish the mutual sense of threat that nations that are contending with each other seem to present to each other. Now, Gagnon, by contrast, has a different view of the origins of the competition and violence that is so widespread among nations. He says it's not, of course, about ancient hatreds, nor about external security concerns, whether these are manufactured or provoked, but by the dynamics of in-group conflict. So Posen looks at the relationships among the nations as an IR theorist would, a realist theorist would. And Gagnon, by contrast, says, let's look at how the groups operate within and see how that affects their interaction with other groups. And he argues, in a sense, back to the view of nations and nationalisms as the manufacture of elites, that elites often provoke conflict in order to solidify their position within the community in question. And that power holders in national groups and ethnic groups will often be playing, if you will, a Janus face game, trying to solidify their position within the group by behaving as if there's a great threat outside the group, and then using the solidarity within the group to threaten the outside. So from his vantage point, it's not simply how they interact with each other, but you also have to look inside the group itself. The major conflicts, says he, taking place along ethnic lines throughout the world have had their main causes not in ancient hatreds, again, but rather the purposeful actions of political actors who actively create violent conflict, selectively drawing on history in order to portray it as historically inevitable. Read back from that statement Lynch's discussion of Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. And you see essentially nationalist markets and democracy has been a principal aggravating cause of group hatred and ethnic violence. How is this so? Because, she argues, markets and democracy benefit different ethnic groups in such societies, therefore creating highly unstable and combustible conditions. Those words are hers. So when you think about markets and democracy, we tend to think about them as having impacts on things like citizens and consumers, or maybe producers. But we don't think about which are those formal, abstract, contentless identities in which we are all interchangeable. But in practice, of course, markets, democracies, political processes, economic processes, and so forth, do not treat us simply as those faceless actors, but differentiate among us in part on the basis of educational levels or ethnic ties or wealth or all sorts of other kinds of things that can contribute to these sort of distinctions within society, and particularly where certain kinds of professions or certain kinds of economic endeavors were associated historically with certain kinds of ethnic groups. These sorts of changes may create and exacerbate tensions within societies between those very groups. So, as she puts it quite simply, but one could look around not only at the cases she provides, but in other instances as well, markets will often, not necessarily, but will often in practice concentrate wealth in the hands of minorities. Competition for votes in democracy, if we're advocating democratization, often fosters demagogues who will use their position to stir up as identity entrepreneurs nationalist enthusiasms. And these both, whether the impact of the market or the impact of democratic politics, will create circumstances for a backlash against markets or against democracy or against the minority. So that there are a lot of things that can be understood as perspectives on what contributes to ethnic conflict. It can be a security dilemma. It can be ethnic entrepreneurs within a community. It can be global forces which reshape relations among communities and societies, in particular states. But it's fairly clear, whatever perspective you bring to these sorts of questions, we have ethnic conflict. And so the final question, and to which much of the reading of this week is devoted, is how ethnic conflict can be managed and ideally resolved. Are there institutional arrangements? Are there policies that we can advocate that mitigate the conflict, that provide alternative, nonviolent ways of managing what are, at this point, for better or for worse, now constructed identities, ideologies, and relationships? So that's much of what you will be thinking about between now and your discussions. There are power-sharing models. There are advocates for partition in particular cases or for secession. Say it is impossible for these communities to live together. Give them their own independent states. It is possible for these communities to live together, but only if they are represented in government as communities, not simply as a whole society of individuals. So advocates of minority rights, advocates of power sharing, and so forth say it is important to have community representation, not simply popular representation in democracies. Those are kinds of elements of power sharing, and by and large, as you'll see, the advocates of power sharing, of whom Arendt Leiphart is probably the most prominent, themselves concede that it doesn't always work, and it only probably works well in very particular circumstances. There should be, as he puts it, representatives of all the significant groups in the government. The groups should have autonomy. The government posts should be distributed proportionally. The minorities should have vetoes on vital issues. It's not clear how realistic those desiderata are in most of the cases where we are considering trying to manage ethnic and national conflict. Partition has all of the kinds of pros and cons that you can imagine, and Kaufman and Kumar discuss it in some detail, so I will not unless you have questions about it. But the last question is really whether nationalism and national identities and multiple nationalisms in a particular political unit or state can be reconciled with democracy. And the democracy promotion discussion is vast and important, and we've talked about it a little bit already, the kinds of things that Robert Dahl talked about when we looked at the origins of liberalism and democracy. We'll be looking at democracy yet again later in the semester. But it's worth thinking about the extent to which much of the way we think about democracy is confounded when people have not simply individual identities as citizens, and popular representation is not simply the representation of my interests and my perspectives as an individual, but also has to take into account the aspirations of people as members of communities, and particularly members of ethnic and national communities. And under those circumstances, democracy is not necessarily ideally equipped to represent those interests in ways that satisfy the citizens. So it may be, and we return to Dahl, that part of what we need to be thinking about when we think about how to promote democracy, particularly in divided societies, is to think about the sequence of institutional innovation. And it may be that simply giving people the universal suffrage and the vote lays the ground more for the development of the demagogues that I was talking about before than it does resolves the kinds of conflicts that are what the democracy is supposed to address. This is the debate which Professor Snyder has been not only a social scientist in, but an advocate as in providing a variety of kinds of policy advice to the democracy promotion community. And I commend those sorts of debates to you for your sections. And I think that's probably enough. I have 10 or 15 minutes for questions if you want to revisit any of this discussion. Thank you very much.